There is something that happens after the world goes quiet. Not peace, not relief, just more noticing. The sounds that were buried under the day's noise rise to the surface. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of something settling in the walls, your own breath, slightly louder than it was an hour ago, and your thoughts circling. If you have ever found yourself awake like this, not anxious exactly, not sad exactly, just watching everything, including your own watching, then tonight is for you, because there is a name for the kind of mind that cannot stop observing. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying it. He called it hyper-consciousness. He lived with it himself, and what he discovered was not a diagnosis or a defect. It was a map of why certain people feel too much, see too clearly, and struggle to rest inside a world that was not built for them. Tonight, we are going to follow that map together. You do not need to take notes. You do not need to do anything at all. Just let the words come in the way that water comes in, quietly, without asking permission. There is a question underneath this whole conversation. We will return to it. But for now, just notice one thing: the fact that you are here, still awake, still aware, still watching. That is not a flaw. It may be the most important thing about you. Jung once wrote that who looks outside dreams, and who looks inside awakes. Tonight, we are sitting with what it means to be the kind of person who has always looked inside. The kind of person for whom wakefulness is not just a physical state, but a permanent orientation toward the world. Let your breath come a little slower. We have a long journey tonight. 30 conversations, each one a little quieter than the last. By the end, something may feel different, not solved, not fixed, but understood in a way it has not been understood before. You have been noticing everything for a long time. Tonight, something notices you back. And here is where we begin. Not with a theory, but with a scene. A room in Zurich, 1913. A man sitting alone at a desk in the middle of the night, unsure whether what was happening to him was genius or madness. That man was Carl Gustav Jung. And what he did in that room, what he allowed himself to do, changed everything we know about the mind that will not stop watching. But first, let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Just for a moment, let the noticing rest. Because even the most aware mind deserves a few seconds of simply being held. Carl Jung was born in 1875 inches, a small village in Switzerland, the son of a pastor who had lost his faith. His childhood was quiet and strange. He played alone in the garden for hours, carving small figures from wood, holding conversations with himself that felt more real than the ones he had with other children. He was, from the beginning, the kind of person who noticed things others did not. Not surface things, not facts or details, but the undercurrent, the feeling beneath the feeling, the thing that was not being said in a room full of people saying things. He described himself as a child who felt he was somehow two people, a boy who went to school and ate meals and had friends, and an older, stranger figure who watched all of this from a distance. Not with judgment, just with a kind of permanent, bewildered attention. If you have ever felt that way, present in a room but slightly outside it, watching yourself have a conversation while you are having it, then you already understand something essential about Jung. That doubleness never left him. It became the engine of everything he built. And here is the detail that changes it. Jung did not try to eliminate the watching part of himself. He fed it. He took it seriously. He built an entire psychology around the discovery that the watching self, the part that observes, doubts, and notices, is not the problem. It is the path. But paths are not comfortable things, especially in the dark. Before we go further, let the weight of your body settle into whatever is beneath you. Your legs, your back, the back of your head. Just feel the contact. Just feel the rest. We will be here for a while, and the story is only beginning. Because once Jung understood what the observing mind was, he had to understand what it cost. And what it was, underneath all that observation, quietly asking for. That question holds the whole map, and it is closer to you than you may think. Chapter 2. The Burden of Noticing. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You know this one. It is not the tiredness of physical effort, the satisfying weight in the legs after a long walk, the ache of honest work. It is something older, a tiredness that lives behind the eyes, the tiredness of noticing too much for too long, noticing the tension in a conversation before anyone has said anything difficult, noticing the shift in someone's voice, barely a degree, and knowing something has changed. Noticing the mood of a room the moment you step into it, the way a trained ear notices a note that is slightly off-key. This is not a skill you chose to develop. It was always there. And it is. As Carl Jung spent decades trying to explain, a double-edged quality. It makes you perceptive, empathetic, deep. And it makes you, at the end of ordinary days, more exhausted than ordinary days should leave you. Because the overaware mind is not just processing information, it is processing meaning. It is reaching beneath the surface of things, searching for the pattern, the implication, the hidden weight of what just happened. And it does this all the time. In the grocery store, in a quiet conversation. In the 5 seconds before you fall asleep. Jung had a patient, a successful man, well-liked, professionally admired, who came to him in his 40s with a peculiar complaint. He described sitting at a dinner party, surrounded by people he had known for years and feeling, without explanation, profoundly alone. Not isolated by circumstance, isolated by something he could not name. A glass wall, he said, clear enough to see through, thick enough to stop anything from really reaching him. He was not depressed. He was not sad, not in any simple sense. He was aware of the gap between what was being said and what was being felt. Aware of the performance everyone around him was unconsciously giving, including himself. Aware, and this was the heaviest part, of his own watching. He had spent 40 years developing the sensitivity to notice everything. And now the noticing had become its own cage. Jung told him something that has stayed useful across a century. He said the problem was not the awareness itself. The problem was that the man had never found a way to receive what his awareness was telling him. He had developed only the first half of a skill. He could see, but he had never learned to metabolize what he saw. Let the next breath come a little slower. Let your hands relax wherever they are. Metabolizing awareness. That is a strange phrase. Let us stay with it. Think about how your body handles food. You take something in, you break it down. Some of it becomes energy. Some of it is released. The process has a rhythm, a logic, a natural completion. Now think about the over-aware mind. It takes things in constantly. Impressions, atmospheres, meanings, undertones. But if there is no process to break these down, no ritual, no solitude, no way of sitting with what has been absorbed, it accumulates. Layer on layer, day on day, and what accumulates begins to press. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a weight, a tightness behind the eyes, a reluctance to enter crowded rooms, a relief that can feel almost physical when, at the end of a day full of people, you finally close a door and find yourself alone. The alone part is not antisocial, it is necessary. It is the only time the mind can actually finish what it started during the day. Here is a quieter layer beneath that. The burden of noticing is not just the noticing itself. It is the loneliness that comes with it. Because to notice things others are not noticing is to live in a slightly different version of reality. Not a better version, not a superior one, just a different one. A version with more texture, more nuance, more noise. And when you describe what you are experiencing, the undercurrent you felt in that conversation, the way something shifted in a room, the way a throwaway comment landed heavier than anyone seemed to register, you often encounter a particular kind of silence. The silence of people who genuinely do not know what you are talking about, not because they are dull, not because they are unfeeling, simply because their perceptual threshold is set differently from yours. And over years, that silence teaches you something you did not mean to learn. It teaches you to stop saying the thing you noticed, to keep the perception quiet, to smile and nod and answer the question that was asked instead of the one underneath it. This is where it gets interesting, because that suppression, that learned habit of keeping the deeper noticing private, is exactly what Jung identified as the origin of the divided self. The self that observes and the self that performs. And between those two selves, a gap that grows very slowly over years of ordinary days. But notice this: you are still here, still listening, still aware, even now, even in the quiet. That is not a burden tonight. That is the first step toward the map. Chapter 3, when consciousness becomes heavy, there is a threshold, not one you cross in a single day. Not one you could point to on a calendar and say, there, that was the moment. But there is a threshold somewhere in the accumulation of years where consciousness, the gift of being awake to your own inner life, begins to feel less like a gift and more like a stone you carry. Carl Jung described this shift in a way that was unusually honest for a man of his era and stature. He said that a great deal of suffering in the modern world was not the suffering of loss or trauma in the ordinary sense. It was the suffering of too much self-awareness without the tools to make meaning of what that awareness revealed. He called it the problem of the educated West. He could just as easily have called it the problem of anyone who has spent decades paying close attention to themselves and the people around them, and who has arrived somewhere in the middle of their life feeling, despite all that attention, not more peaceful, but more burdened. Let us sit with what heavy consciousness actually feels like. Not the clinical description, the real one. It feels like standing at the edge of a conversation and already knowing, before it has happened, how it will go, which means you are not fully present for the conversation. You are pre-experiencing it, running simulations, preparing. It feels like reading a room faster than the room has given you permission to read it, and then having to pretend you did not. It feels like carrying the emotional subtext of every interaction alongside the interaction itself, not as an additional burden you chose, as something automatic, involuntary, like breathing. And at the end of the day, all of that secondary processing, all of that reading beneath the reading, sits somewhere inside you, unresolved, asking to be looked at. That is the weight. In the winter of 1913, Carl Jung sat down alone in his study and tried to do something most people would have found alarming. He deliberately allowed his consciousness to sink, not into sleep, not into distraction, into something deeper. He sat in his chair, closed his eyes, and let whatever wanted to rise from the depths of his mind rise. He heard voices. He saw figures. A woman he called his soul. An old prophet he called Elijah. He wrote them down in a large red book that he kept hidden for decades. And here is the part that matters tonight. He did not run from what rose. He did not diagnose it or medicate it or perform some therapeutic technique to neutralize it. He met it. He had a conversation with it. He discovered that the heaviness of his consciousness was not a defect. It was a pressure building towards something. The weight he had been carrying was not a sign that something was wrong. It was a signal that something unattended was asking to be attended to. Let your shoulders drop. Let the breath move on its own. Jung came to believe that the heaviness of an overaware mind is always, at its core, a message, not a pleasant one, not a simple one, but a message. The message is this: something in you has been seen but not yet held. Something has been noticed but not yet integrated. Something has risen close enough to the surface to press and has been waiting with extraordinary patience for you to be ready to look at it. The Stoics had a version of this. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in a military tent 2,000 years ago, wrestled with something similar. He was the most powerful man in the ancient world. He had access to every philosophy, every physician, every distraction that wealth and power could provide. And still, he wrote, not to the world, but to himself, about the exhaustion of the watching mind, about how consciousness, fully awake, found no easy rest in comfort or achievement. His prescription was not to quiet the watching. It was to direct it more honestly, to turn the same unflinching gaze he applied to everything external, inward, toward his own motives, his own fears, his own unexamined assumptions. That turning inward, that deliberate redirection of the watching mind is what Jung would, 18 centuries later, call the beginning of individuation. There is a small but important detail in how Marcus Aurelius actually wrote his meditations. He did not write them for anyone else, not for posterity, not for his children or his advisors or the historians he knew were watching his reign. He wrote them for himself. In Greek, not Latin, his public language, as if he wanted an additional layer of privacy, as if he needed to speak to himself in a language that felt more interior, and what he wrote was not wisdom for the ages, it was reminders to himself. Because he kept forgetting. He reminded himself repeatedly that most of what worried him was not within his control. He reminded himself to look at things as they actually were, not as he feared they were. He reminded himself again and again that he was going to die, and that this fact should clarify rather than terrify. The most powerful man in the world needed daily reminders of things he already knew, because knowing is not the same as having. Knowledge does not automatically become experience. Understanding does not automatically become peace. This is the condition the heavy consciousness lives in, and it was true for an emperor, and it is true for you. But we are not there yet. Right now, we are still naming the weight, still sitting with what it actually feels like to be someone for whom consciousness is not a background condition, but a foreground presence. And there is one more layer to this that deserves a quiet moment before we move on. Heavy consciousness is often invisible to the people around you. From the outside, you may look fine, composed, perhaps even calm. You have spent years learning to contain what you carry. The integration is seamless, the performance is practiced. But here, in the dark, with the world finally quiet enough to tell the truth, you know the weight. And so does the part of you that has been waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Consider it acknowledged. The map continues from here. Chapter 4. The Ego That Never Sleeps. Carl Jung used the word ego differently than most people use it today. When we say someone has a big ego, we usually mean they think too highly of themselves. But Jung meant something more precise and more interesting. For Jung, the ego was simply the conscious part of the self, the part that knows it exists, the part that says, I. And for certain people, for people like you, who have been aware of themselves for as long as they can remember, the ego is extraordinarily active. It is the part of you that monitors, that evaluates, that asks quietly and constantly, how am I doing? Am I reading this correctly? What does this mean? What does it say about me that I reacted that way? It is not vanity. It is not self-absorption in the ordinary sense. It is a kind of relentless administrative function, a part of the mind that never actually clocks off. Most people can lose themselves in a conversation. They can be fully present at a dinner table, in a film, in a piece of music, without a part of them watching the losing themselves happen. The hyper-aware ego cannot do this easily. Even at its most engaged, a part of it is standing slightly to the side, watching. There was a philosopher in 17th century France who described this problem with uncomfortable precision. Blaise Pascal was one of the finest mathematical minds of his era. He was also chronically ill, deeply anxious, and constitutionally unable to rest. He spent his short life, he died at 39, in a kind of perpetual internal vigil, aware of his own awareness with a clarity that brought no peace. He wrote in a fragment that was published only after his death. All of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly alone in a room. People have quoted this line for 300 years, usually as a wry observation about distraction. But Pascal meant something more specific. He meant that the ego, left alone with itself, cannot tolerate its own company for long. Not because the ego is weak, because it is relentlessly active, because it cannot stop producing thoughts, evaluations, narratives, defenses. The ego that never sleeps is not resting when the body rests. It is rehearsing tomorrow. It is reviewing yesterday. It is asking questions that have no answers at midnight and generating answers that will seem wrong by morning. Feel the weight of your body right now, your head against the pillow or the cushion or wherever you are resting. The ego is still running. That is all right. We are not trying to stop it tonight. We are just watching it. From a little further back, Jung's insight was that the ego, for all its industriousness, is only a small part of what we are. He described it as an island in a vast ocean. The island believes itself to be solid, bounded, real. It does not feel the ocean beneath it. But the ocean is always there, moving, shifting, sending things up to the shore that the island did not ask for and does not always want. The unconscious mind in Jung's model is incomparably larger than the conscious ego. It holds everything that has not yet been admitted into awareness, every feeling that was too inconvenient to feel, every experience that was absorbed without being fully processed, every aspect of the personality that was cultivated in private while a more acceptable version was presented to the world. For the overaware ego, this creates a particular tension, because the overaware ego knows the ocean is there. It can feel the current beneath the island. It notices the things that wash up at the shore, the unexpected emotion, the dream that arrives with unusual weight, the irrational resistance to ordinary situations, and it tries to manage all of this, to categorize it, explain it, integrate it through thought alone. But the ocean does not respond to management. It responds to something else. Here is the small detail that changes everything. Jung spent decades studying the relationship between the ego and the unconscious, and what he consistently found was this. The ego that tries to control the unconscious exhausts itself. The ego that learns to listen to it, to sit quietly in the room with it, finds something unexpected, not the answers it was looking for, but a kind of companionship, the sense that the vast, dark part of the self is not the enemy of the aware part. It is its counterweight, its correction, the part that knows what the ego has forgotten to know. For the hyper-aware ego, this is initially bewildering, because it implies that all the watching, all the monitoring, all the relentless self-observation has been directed at the wrong territory. The ego watches the surface. The truth lives in the depths. But the depths are not inaccessible. They come up every night in the one place the ego cannot follow completely. In dreams, we will get there. But first, there is something closer to address. The thing the ego does when it cannot sleep, when it cannot stop, when the noticing has no object except itself. And that is where we are, right now, in this quiet. The ego that never sleeps is aware of you reading this. It is probably evaluating whether this is useful, whether it applies, whether you are the kind of person being described. Notice that noticing, and then let it rest, just slightly, against the weight of everything else that is here tonight. The story is just beginning. Chapter 5. Why some minds observe too much. Not everyone became this way through choice. That seems obvious to say. But it is worth saying, because the overaware mind often carries a subtle, unspoken assumption that its hypervigilance is a personal failing, a habit of catastrophizing dressed up as intelligence, an indulgence of sensitivity that better adjusted people would not permit themselves. This is not accurate. And Jung was insistent about this. The observing mind in most cases became what it is through a kind of necessary adaptation, an early response to an environment that required more reading, more watching, more internal processing than ordinary environments require. Let us be specific. Some children grow up in households where the atmosphere shifts without warning, where an adult's mood, unexplained, unpredictable, can change the entire temperature of a room. And so the child learns quickly and without instruction to read the room before entering it, to watch the set of someone's shoulders, to notice the small signs that something is about to change. This skill, developed under pressure, honed over years, does not disappear when the environment that shaped it does. It becomes the default mode, the perceptual baseline, the way the mind approaches everything from then on. Cautiously, attentively, reading several layers at once. There is a scene many people know without recognizing it as their own. You walk into a room, a family gathering, a work meeting, a party full of people you see regularly, and within 30 seconds, before a single word has been exchanged, you have already assessed the mood. You know where the tension is. You can feel, like a change in barometric pressure, the emotional weather. Others walk into the same room and feel nothing in particular. They make themselves a drink and start a conversation. You cannot do that yet. You have to process the room first. This is not anxiety, exactly. It is attunement. And it was learned. Let the next breath come a little slower. Let your eyes close if they want to. Jung was interested in the moment when healthy attunement tips into something more burdensome. And he identified something that is useful to understand tonight. He said that the adapted response, the watchfulness learned in response to real external conditions, eventually becomes generalized. The mind that learned to watch unpredictable adults begins watching everyone. The internal alarm system that was once calibrated for genuine uncertainty begins triggering in ordinary situations, safe situations. And the person cannot always tell the difference, because the mechanism is automatic. It runs beneath conscious awareness. The body tightens, the attention sharpens, the reading begins, and only afterward does the conscious mind notice that the room was safe the whole time. This is not a character flaw. It is not even strictly psychological, in the sense of being a story the mind is telling itself. It is, as Bessel van der Kolk spent decades demonstrating, a body phenomenon. The nervous system holds the lessons of old environments long after those environments are gone. The muscles carry the posture of vigilance. The breath shortens habitually in anticipation of something that is no longer coming. The overaware mind is often simply a body that learned to be ready. The modern human character version of this lives everywhere. Consider the person who has built a successful professional life. Competent, respected, reliably excellent, who still, in every meeting, finds themselves watching the faces of the people in the room rather than simply participating, still checking for the shift that signals disapproval, still performing the assessment that made sense once, long ago, and has never stopped running. Or the person who, at the end of a warm and uncomplicated evening with people they genuinely love, arrives home and begins the review. What did I say that landed wrong? What did I miss? Was there something in that look that I should have addressed? The evening was good. The review happens anyway. Something changes when you see it from this angle. Because if the overaware mind was learned, if it was a response to a real set of conditions, then it can be updated, not erased, not dismantled, but taught gradually that the conditions have changed, that the room it is reading now is different from the rooms it learned to read then. Jung believed this update was not primarily a cognitive process. It was not a matter of thinking your way into a different perception. It was a matter of having experiences, new experiences, held over time that gave the nervous system different data to work with. The experience of entering a room and not being required to read it first. The experience of saying something difficult and finding that the person across from you did not leave. The experience of allowing your own depth to be seen and discovering that the depth was not, in fact, too much. We are heading toward that, but not yet. First, we need to stay a little longer with what the observing mind actually does, what it produces, what it builds in the long years of watching. Because the overaware mind is not passive. It does not simply notice and move on. It builds something. Picture this scene. You are at a gathering you looked forward to, people you like, conversation that moves well. Nothing is wrong by any measurable standard. And yet, somewhere around the 40-minute mark, a tiredness begins. Not the tiredness of boredom, something more specific. The particular fatigue of someone who has been processing on two levels simultaneously, the surface of the conversation and the deeper register of what everyone in the room is feeling, what is not being said, what the slightly forced laughter around one person's joke was actually about. You have been working twice as hard as anyone around you, and no one knows, including sometimes you. That invisible second shift, the processing of the underneath while participating in the surface, is what the overaware mind builds over years into something automatic and continuous. It is not chosen, it is not indulged. It runs the way a background process runs on a computer, drawing resources, generating heat without ever appearing in the foreground where it could be addressed. And what it builds across a life of doing this is both extraordinary and costly. Extraordinary because the understanding of people and situations it produces is genuine and deep. Costly because the resource it draws from is finite, and the account from which it draws, the account that is meant to fund rest, genuine presence, and the simple pleasure of being somewhere without monitoring everything, begins, over years, to run a little low. This is not a crisis. It is information. It is the instrument communicating its own needs. And what it builds will take us deeper into Jung and deeper into the map that has been waiting for you all this time. Chapter 6: Overthinking and the Divided Self. Overthinking is a word that gets used too casually. When most people use it, they mean thinking about something longer than the situation warrants. A small worry given too much airtime. A decision analyzed beyond the point of diminishing returns. But the overthinking that belongs to the genuinely overaware mind is something different in character. It is not just extended thinking. It is a split. The mind thinking about a thing and simultaneously thinking about the thinking. Monitoring the monitoring. Evaluating the evaluation. This is the divided self that Carl Jung spent his life mapping. Not a metaphor, not a poetic description of ambivalence. A real structural feature of certain kinds of consciousness, in which the observing part of the self has become so developed, so practiced, that it seems almost to operate as a separate entity from the feeling part. The feeling part says, "I am afraid." The observing part immediately asks, "Why? Is this fear rational? Have I examined its origins? Is this a habitual response or a response to something real? Should I feel this? Should I push it away? What does it mean that I feel it?" And by the time those questions have been asked, the fear has gone underground, not resolved, but submerged beneath the inquiry. Jung described this split with unusual compassion. He did not see the observing part of the self as the enemy of the feeling part. He saw it as, potentially, the most intelligent part, but only if it could learn to cooperate with feeling rather than override it. And here is the piece that most conversations about overthinking miss. The divided self is not thinking too much. It is feeling too little, or rather, feeling without allowing the feeling to complete itself. Taking in an emotional experience, beginning to process it, and then, at the point where the processing would require some vulnerability, some uncertainty, some loss of control, switching back to analysis. Because analysis feels safe. Feeling does not, especially for a mind that learned early that feelings could be unpredictable, could be too much for the room, could be misread, dismissed, or used against you. Analysis at least has the appearance of being in control of the situation. Let your jaw soften. Let the next breath come without effort. There is a scene from the story bank that belongs here. Picture someone sitting in their car in the parking lot outside a hospital after receiving some health news. Not necessarily devastating news. Just news that changes the shape of the future in some small but irreversible way. They sit with the engine off. And instead of feeling what is there to be felt, the shock, the fear, the strange underwater quality of a changed reality, they begin planning what to do next, who to call, what questions to ask at the follow-up appointment, how to research the options. The planning is real and useful, but it is also shelter. At some point, sitting in that parking lot with all the plans made and no one to call yet, they notice a bird, a small one, on the curb. And their eyes stay on the bird for a long time. And in the watching of the bird, in the brief cessation of the planning, the feeling they had been outrunning arrives, not in the form of breakdown. Just a tightening in the throat, a sudden awareness of the warmth of the sun on their arm through the car window. The sense of being here, small, in a large world, with something unresolved. That moment, that arriving of the feeling after the planning, is the gap between the divided halves of the self closing. Just slightly. It does not last long. The phone buzzes, life resumes. But it was real. And the reunification it offered, even briefly, is exactly what Jung believed the whole work of psychological life was aimed at. The divided self is not a permanent condition. It is a learned posture. And postures, held long enough, begin to feel like anatomy. They begin to feel like the only way the body can be held. But they can change, not through effort exactly, not through the kind of forcing that the overaware mind reaches for naturally, through something more like softening. We will come back to this. The thread will return. For now, it is enough to simply notice that when the thinking and the feeling are separated, when the watching self has grown so large it crowds out the experiencing self, something essential is being lost. Not intelligence, not depth, contact. The contact with your own inner life that makes rest possible. That makes the long quiet of a night feel like restoration rather than interrogation. And that is a loss worth understanding, so that it can, in time, be recovered. Chapter 7. Anxiety beneath awareness. There is a particular kind of anxiety that the clinics have no clean name for. Not panic, not phobia. Not the generalized anxiety that arrives like weather and lifts like weather. This is something quieter and older. More specifically, architectural. It is the anxiety of the person who knows too much about themselves, who has read the books, done the reflecting, understands the patterns, who can name their attachment style and trace the origin of their core wound and articulate in clear language exactly why they respond to uncertainty the way they do, and who is still anxious. Not because the understanding failed, but because understanding and peace are not the same thing. And the part of us that is most anxious does not respond to argument. Carl Jung had a phrase for this. He talked about the terrible clarity of the person who has developed consciousness without the integration to hold it. What he meant was this: when awareness outpaces integration, when the mind sees more than it can carry, understands more than it can metabolize, a particular kind of anxiety is the result. Not an anxiety about external events, an anxiety about the inner world itself, about the gap between what you perceive and what you can do with that perception, about the distance between knowing yourself and being at ease with yourself, about the parts of you that have been identified, named, analyzed, and are still, in some corner of the night, doing exactly what they have always done. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who spent his adult life in a state of productive, creative anxiety that he could never quite resolve, said something that has not dated. He said that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. He meant that anxiety arises not from the presence of threat, but from the presence of possibility, from the awareness that things could be otherwise, that you could choose differently, that you are not fixed. For the overaware mind, this is a specific kind of vertigo, because you are aware of how many choices you are making, moment to moment, how many other versions of yourself could have emerged from other choices. How many paths run alongside the one you are on, parallel and unexplored. And that awareness, that constant peripheral vision of the unlived life, is not a trivial thing to carry. Let the weight of your body rest fully where it is. Nothing to decide right now, nothing to choose. But here is what Kierkegaard also understood, and what Jung elaborated across his long career. The anxiety does not mean something is wrong. It means something is sensitive. It means the instrument is calibrated finely. It means you are someone whose inner life is real enough to exert pressure. The person who feels nothing in the dark, who sleeps through every uncertainty and wakes refreshed and uncomplicated. They are not more evolved. They are not more at peace, necessarily. They are simply less available to their own depth. The anxiety of the overaware mind is, in most cases, the signal of depth trying to be integrated. It is not the enemy. It is the part of you that wants to be heard more fully than it has been. There are two kinds of tiredness. You may have caught that phrase near the beginning of tonight. Here is where it returns. The first kind of tiredness is the body, the muscles, the eyes, the processing of a full day. The second kind is older, more specific. It is the tiredness of someone who has been running a second system, the awareness system, the monitoring system, the reading everything simultaneously system on top of the first one, all day, for years. The second kind of tiredness does not lift with sleep the way the first kind does, because it is not located in the body, in the same way. It is located in the relationship between the watching self and the rest of the self, in the gap between what is perceived and what is integrated, and what resolves it slowly, imperfectly, over time, is not more analysis, it is not more understanding, it is something Jung called simply being met, being in contact with another person, with a creative practice, with the unconscious through dreams or imagery, in a way that does not require you to perform your awareness, in a way that allows the feeling self to exist alongside the watching self without one overriding the other. That is the possibility we are building toward tonight. Not a technique, not a cure. A different relationship with the awareness that has been living in you all this time. One in which it is no longer something you carry, but something that carries you. Chapter 8, Persona and Private Exhaustion. There is a version of you that you bring into the world every day. It has a posture, a tone of voice, a particular way of handling difficulty, composed, considered, reliable, a way of listening that signals attention without overwhelming the room, a way of existing in social space that is calibrated over years to produce a particular response in other people. Jung called this the persona. He borrowed the word from the Latin for mask, the large painted masks that actors in ancient theatre wore so that the audience could see their role from a distance. The persona in Jung's psychology is the face we develop for the world, the version of ourselves that we offer to the offices and the dinner tables and the group conversations. And it is not dishonest, exactly. The persona contains real aspects of who you are. It is not a lie, but it is selective. It emphasizes certain qualities and leaves others in shadow. It presents the parts of yourself that function well in the world and keeps quieter the parts that are rawer, more complicated, less easily explained. For most people, the persona is a comfortable and largely unconscious thing. They slip into it in the morning and out of it at night without much friction. For the overaware person, it is exhausting. Here is what makes it exhausting. The overaware person knows they are wearing the persona. They can feel the switching on, the slight adjustment in self-presentation that happens when they walk into a room, the monitoring of how they are landing, the curation of which feelings to show and which to hold back. They do not experience this as dishonest. They experience it as necessary, as the price of participating in social life without overwhelming it. But the monitoring required to maintain the persona, the constant internal check of, is this too much? Is this landing right? Am I reading the room correctly? Is its own cognitive load. And it is By the end of a full day of human contact, profoundly tiring. Let your jaw relax. Let your hands open slightly. Jung was interested in what happens to the energy that goes into maintaining the persona. He noted that the more energy a person spends on the social face, the less energy is available for the private self. And the private self, the one that is not performing, not curating, not managing the social impression, begins to starve. Not dramatically, slowly, over time. What starves is not the intellect. The intellect often thrives under these conditions. The persona of the overaware person is frequently brilliant, articulate, warm, perceptive, a genuine pleasure to encounter. What starves is the part that simply exists without function, the part that rests without an audience, the part that can feel something without immediately translating it into a form that others can receive. Picture the person who arrives home after a long day. Not a difficult day necessarily, just a full one, full of other people, other needs, other atmospheres to read and respond to. They close the door, and there is a transition that needs to happen, a depressurization, a shedding of the persona weight. But if they live with other people, the transition is interrupted. There is someone else's day to hear about, a meal to think about, the evening's logistics. And so the persona never fully comes off. And the private self, the one that was supposed to get a few hours of simply existing without performance, goes to bed still wearing mask, and then wonders why sleep does not fully restore. The private exhaustion of the overaware persona is this. The mask and the face have been in contact for so long that distinguishing between them has become effortful. Not because the person has lost themselves. They have not. But because the habit of self-monitoring extends even into the private moments, the watching self does not stop watching at home. The self-evaluation does not clock off when the door closes. And so what should be rest becomes a different kind of performance. The performance of being at ease, the persona of the private person. And yet, there is a particular kind of connection that the overaware person is capable of that is worth naming here. Because the same depth that produces the loneliness also produces the capacity for a quality of relating that most people only experience in flashes. When the overaware person does encounter someone who can hold their full depth, who does not flinch at the complexity, who does not try to simplify what is complicated, who finds the strange interior world interesting rather than overwhelming, the connection that becomes possible is extraordinary. Not because of what is said, often because of what does not need to be said. The sense of being in a room with someone and not needing to monitor whether the awareness is too much. Of being able to speak from the actual interior rather than the curated version. Of feeling for the rare and precious hour, not alone in the specific way that has been the baseline. These connections are rare. but they happen. And the overaware person is the one most likely to recognize them when they do, because they have spent enough time in the ordinary loneliness to know exactly what is different about this moment. The depth that separated you also makes you capable of the deepest possible meeting. That is not a consolation. It is simply true. Jung's prescription, which we will explore at length before this night is done, was not to dismantle the persona. He was not interested in authenticity as performance. He did not suggest that people should express everything they feel to everyone, as if radical transparency were the same as integration. His prescription was subtler. He said, "Learn the difference between you and the mask. Not to throw the mask away, but so that you can take it off deliberately. Rest inside yourself. Exist for designated periods as the raw thing beneath the polished surface. That is where the energy replenishes. That is where the exhaustion lifts, not in the vacation or the weekend or the sleep. In the moments of genuine unperformed existence, they can be small. A walk alone, a piece of music listened to with the lights off, a night like this one, where nobody is watching, and you are simply here with the honest weight of your own inner life. This is not self-indulgence. This is the maintenance of a self. Chapter 9, The Cost of Self-Consciousness. There is a tax on self-consciousness. It is not paid in any currency that shows up on a ledger. It is paid in something subtler, in moments of presence lost to watching, in conversations entered but not fully inhabited, in joy experienced with a small part of the self standing slightly outside it, noting that the joy is happening. You know what this costs. You have felt the particular quality of being happy and simultaneously aware of being happy, which somehow makes the happiness a degree less complete, less purely itself. This is one of the features of the overaware life that is hardest to explain to someone who does not share it, because the people who are simply happy in a moment are not aware of being happy. They are just inside it, unself-conscious, absorbed. The self-conscious person is always at least slightly outside the experience, the observer and the participant at once. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian-American psychologist who spent decades studying optimal human experience, discovered something relevant here. He found that the state people described as most satisfying, most alive, most deeply engaged, was one characterized by the almost complete suspension of self-consciousness. He called it flow, the state of total absorption in a meaningful task in which the internal observer goes quiet. The split between the watching self and the experiencing self collapses briefly into something unified. This is why certain activities feel so restorative to the overaware person, the ones that are demanding enough to fully occupy the monitoring mind, that take everything you have and ask you to give it so completely that there is no leftover processing capacity for the self-watching. A complex piece of music played or listened to with full attention. A long walk in demanding terrain. A creative problem at the edge of your ability. A conversation so genuine and absorbing that you forget to assess how you are landing. These are not escapes from the self. They are reunifications of the self. Let the next breath come without thinking about it. Let your body be held by what is beneath it. But the cost of self-consciousness is not just the moments of presence lost. There is a subtler cost that Jung identified. The cost of living in anticipation rather than in experience. The self-conscious mind is perpetually slightly ahead of the present moment. It is imagining how the experience will be registered, evaluated, understood. It is pre-processing before the processing has begun. And that forward lean, that persistent slight displacement from the here of things, is the source of a particular kind of exhaustion that no amount of external rest addresses. Because you cannot rest from a future that has not arrived. You can only be pulled toward it, spending energy on territory that does not yet exist. The philosopher Montaigne understood this long before the psychological language existed to name it. In 1571, at the age of 38, Montaigne retired from public life to a stone tower in Bordeaux. He had lost his closest friend. He had watched his father die. He was, by the standards of his era, at the midpoint of a successful life, and he found himself unable to bear that life's noise any further. In the tower, alone, he began to write. But not about the world and its ideas, as the scholars of his era wrote, about himself, his habits of thought, his fears, his contradictions, his experience of his own mind. He invented in that tower the personal essay, and what drove him to it was precisely the burden of self-consciousness, the need to stop performing his thoughts for others and simply look at them. The act of writing about himself was not narcissism, it was surgery. A way of taking the watching self and giving it a project equal to its capacity. He did not quiet the observer. He put it to work. This is one of the most useful ideas in Jung's whole body of work, and it is underappreciated. The overaware self-conscious mind does not become peaceful by becoming less aware. It becomes peaceful when its awareness is given something worthy to do, something that is not the management of social impression, not the monitoring of emotional temperature, not the perpetual anticipatory modeling of situations that have not arrived, something honest, creative, rooted in genuine curiosity about what is actually there, inside, in the dark. The cost of self-consciousness, paid over years, is a kind of diminishment, not of intelligence, not of capacity, but of the sense that your experience of your own life is directly yours, that you are the primary experiencer, not the primary observer. What Jung offered over a long career of working with people who had paid this tax was a reorientation, not toward less awareness, but toward a different quality of awareness, one that could rest in experience rather than float above it, one that could finally, after years of watching, learn to be watched in return by the deeper self, by the unconscious, by the parts of the psyche that have been waiting quietly for the ego to stop its relentless monitoring long enough to hear them. That waiting is the subject of everything that follows. Chapter 10: Projection and Hidden Meaning. There is something the overaware mind does that it is usually the last to recognize. It projects. Not in the ordinary sense of assuming others feel what you feel. Something more specific than that. Something that Jung identified as one of the central mechanisms of the psychic life and one of the hardest for intelligent, self-aware people to catch in themselves. Projection is what happens when a quality of your own inner life, something you have not recognized as belonging to you, appears instead to belong to the world outside. You encounter a person who irritates you, not mildly, specifically and persistently, in a way that seems disproportionate to what they are actually doing. Or you find yourself drawn to someone with an almost urgent intensity, not just liking them, but feeling irrationally that they carry something you need. Or you see in a situation a meaning that others around you do not see. A weight, a significance, a threat, a promise that seems obvious to you and invisible to everyone else. In each of these cases, something from your inner world is being read into the outer world. And the reading feels like perception. It feels like clarity. It feels like your awareness working at full capacity. But it is, at least in part, your unconscious speaking in the only language it has available, the language of what appears to be happening out there. Jung made a distinction that is worth sitting with tonight. He said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. He was not being moralistic. He was not suggesting that your irritation with another person is always your fault, or that the other person has no genuine qualities worth being annoyed by. He was observing something structural about perception, the qualities we react to most strongly in others, with either attraction or repulsion, are almost always qualities that have a counterpart in us that we have not acknowledged. The person who privately overworks finds themselves furious at colleagues who set limits. The person who suppresses their need. For connection becomes inexplicably cold toward open displays of need in others. The person who has never permitted themselves to be ordinary becomes disproportionately irritated by people who are obviously ordinary and unbothered by it. What we see in the other person is real, but the charge on it, the particular electricity of the reaction, comes from inside. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow, just slightly. For the overaware mind, this is a particularly challenging idea, because the overaware mind prides itself on its accuracy, on seeing truly, on reading the room correctly. The awareness feels like a gift of perception not a potential source of distortion. And this is actually where the trouble compounds. The more sophisticated the observer, the more convincing the projection. The more seamlessly it can be woven into the narrative of accurate perception. The more it can be supported by real detail, real observed behavior, real evidence, while the engine driving the interpretation remains invisible. This is not a failing of intelligence. It is a feature of the architecture. The more developed the conscious awareness, the more the unconscious must communicate through indirect channels. Because the direct channels, the feelings, the impulses, the irrational reactions, are so quickly assessed and explained by the watching mind that they rarely reach their destination. So, the unconscious becomes, in a sense, cleverer. It uses the outer world as its canvas. It puts its messages in the faces of strangers, in the emotional charge of situations, in the hidden meaning that only you can see. There is something both poignant and important in recognizing this, because the person who sees hidden meaning everywhere, who reads beneath the surface of things, who finds significance in patterns others overlook, is not simply imagining things. They are receiving genuine communications from themselves. The question is not whether the perception is real. The question is, where is it coming from? What part of the self is speaking, and what is it trying to say? This is the map Jung was building, the one that begins with the question, what if the things you are most preoccupied with in the outer world, the ones that carry an unusual charge, an unusual weight, are actually messages from the inner world that have found no other way to be heard? What if the meaning you see in things is not wrong, but not quite where you think it is? What if the awareness that has been turned outward for so long is trying through the medium of the world to tell you something about itself? We are not going to answer that question all at once, but it returns gently across the hours ahead. End quote. Growing clearer as the night deepens. For now, just let it sit with you. The projection question, the charge on the perception question, not to produce guilt, not to undermine your trust in your own seeing, but to open a possibility that what you notice in the world is also always what you are noticing in yourself. And that recognition, held without judgment, is one of the quieter forms of healing available to the overaware mind. Chapter 11. When intelligence turns against you. The mind that has been your greatest asset can, under certain conditions, become a very efficient source of suffering. This is not a paradox Jung invented. It is something he observed again and again in his consulting room, across decades of working with people who were, by most measures, among the most capable and perceptive of their era. They came to him not because they were broken. They came because their intelligence, finely honed and extensively applied, had found a use for itself that nobody intended. It had turned inward, and it was now applying to the self the same relentless analytical attention it applied to everything else. Not with warmth, not with the compassion that a wise friend would bring. With the same critical precision, it might apply to a text that needed deconstruction, a problem that needed solving, an error that needed locating and correcting. The inner critic is a specific voice. You likely know it. It is not the voice of conscience, exactly. Conscience speaks when something genuinely matters morally. The inner critic speaks constantly about performance, appearance, social adequacy, the quality of decisions, the appropriateness of emotional responses. It is the voice that reviews the conversation on the way home. That notes, with unerring accuracy, the one thing you said that could have been said better. That asks, at the end of a day that went reasonably well, what you should have done differently. For the intelligent, overaware person, this voice is usually intelligent itself. It does not deal in simple insults. It deals in the kind of precise, well-argued criticism that is very difficult to refute, because it uses your own perceptual material, your own observations about yourself, your own standards. It knows what you value and where you fall short, and it uses that knowledge with perfect fluency. Notice the weight of your body where it rests, just for a moment. Just the weight and the warmth. Jung was interested in where this voice came from. He identified it as a function of what he called the complex, a cluster of charged psychological material organized around a theme that operates semi-autonomously within the psyche. The inner critic in his model is not you, or rather, it is a part of you, a part that absorbed early some version of the message that your natural self was insufficient, that needed correction, that the world's acceptance was conditional on a level of performance that could not quite be reached because the standard kept moving. Once that complex formed, once that critical voice took shape, it began running on its own, evaluating, assessing, comparing, not because it was asked to, because that is what complexes do. They run, and the more intelligent the person, the more material the complex has to work with. There is something worth saying carefully here. The inner critic is not useless. It contains, embedded in its criticism, genuine information about your values, about what you care about the standards you actually hold. The problem is not the presence of the critical faculty. The problem is the absence of a balancing voice, one that speaks with equal fluency but from a different orientation, one that says, yes, you could have done that differently, and also what you did do was enough. The two things are not contradictions. Without that balance, the critical intelligence operates unopposed. And an unopposed critic, even an intelligent and well-intentioned one, will eventually make the territory it occupies uninhabitable. This is when intelligence turns against you, not through stupidity, not through error, but through excess. Through the application of a perfectly functional analytical tool to a domain where analysis alone cannot reach the thing it is looking for. Because what the inner critic is searching for, beneath all its precision, is safety. It believes, and this belief is old and deep, and was not formed irrationally given the conditions in which it was formed, that if it can find and correct every flaw in you before the world does, the world will not reject you. If it can identify every mistake before it becomes a problem, there will be no problems. If it can maintain perfect adequacy, something or someone will finally declare you enough. This is the logic, and it is in its own way loving. The critic was not formed to punish you, it was formed to protect you. It simply never learned that the protection is no longer necessary, or that the cost of the protection has, over time, exceeded whatever danger it was guarding against. Jung called the process of recognizing the origin of inner voices and of slowly changing our relationship to them individuation. It begins not with silencing the critic, it begins with recognizing that the critic is not you. You are the one who hears it. And between the voice and the one who hears, there is a space. In that space, something more generous is possible. We will get there. But first, the body needs to be allowed to rest for a moment. Let your breath come softer. Let the voice, wherever it has been running tonight, be acknowledged. And then set gently, like a letter you have read and can put down. Chapter 12: Trauma and Hyper-Awareness. The word trauma is used so broadly now that it has begun to lose its edges. But in its original and most useful sense, trauma simply means an experience that the nervous system could not fully process at the time it happened. An event or a sustained set of conditions that exceeded the capacity for integration in the moment and was therefore stored in a way that continued to exert pressure long after the event itself had passed. Bessel van der Kolk spent decades demonstrating something that Jung intuited long before the neuroscience existed to confirm. The body keeps the score. Trauma is not stored in the story we tell about it. It is stored in the tissue, in the patterns of the nervous system, in the breath that still shortens involuntarily when something in the present resembles something from the past. And hypervigilance, the state of heightened, constant alertness that characterizes the over-aware life, is in many cases a direct response to experiences that trained the nervous system never to fully relax. This is important to name carefully. Not every over-aware person has experienced what would be clinically categorized as trauma. Some have lived relatively stable lives by external measure and still developed this orientation through temperament, through sensitive dispositions, through the accumulated minor uncertainties of an ordinary human childhood. But for many people who find themselves in the territory of tonight's conversation, people who read everything, who cannot stop noticing, who find true rest elusive, there is somewhere in the history a period or a set of conditions that taught the nervous system to stay on watch, a household where the emotional weather was unpredictable, a period of social difficulty in which reading the room became survival, a relationship in which the signals of safety were unreliable, a loss that came without warning and therefore made all ordinary safety feel provisional. Let the weight of your head rest fully. You do not have to hold it up. What the nervous system learned was this: if I stay alert, I will not be caught off guard. If I keep watching, I will see it coming this time. And the logic was not wrong. Given the original conditions, it was exactly correct. The problem is that the nervous system is extraordinarily good at its job. It generalized the learning. It applied the alert state not just to situations that resembled the original threat, but to the texture of experience itself. So the hyper-aware adult exists in a baseline state of readiness, not because they are anxious in a pathological sense, because their system is doing what it was trained to do, looking for the shift, reading for the signal. And this, combined with a naturally perceptive temperament, produces the overaware mind. Not broken, adapted. Just adapted to conditions that no longer match the current situation. Jung did not have the language of nervous system regulation that modern trauma research has given us, but he understood the essential mechanism. He talked about the psyche's tendency to continue unconsciously to reenact the patterns established in formative experience. Not because it was irrational, but because it was working with the information it had. The psyche, in Jung's model, is not your enemy, not even the parts of it that cause suffering. They are, every one of them, attempts at protection or at completion. Attempts to finish something that was started and never resolved. Hypervigilance is an attempt to be safe. The inner critic is an attempt to be acceptable. Projection is an attempt to make visible what has been invisible. All of these are the psyche working imperfectly, sometimes at great personal cost, towards something it genuinely needs. The question Jung spent his life answering was, how do you help those attempts find a better path? The answer begins not with dismantling the protection, not with forcing a kind of openness the system is not ready for. It begins with something simpler, with recognizing that the alert state, the watching, the noticing, the hypervigilance has been running as if the old conditions are still in place, and that some part of the information available to the nervous system, if it could be updated, would allow it to begin to rest. Not all at once, not through a single insight or a powerful moment of realization, but gradually, in the way that trust is built, through the accumulation of small experiences of safety, through nights like this one, where something in you, some part of the system, is allowed to let its attention soften, where the watching is acknowledged, not as a flaw but as a history, and where the history is gently, carefully held. Chapter 13. The Unconscious at Night. Here is something Jung observed that has not been adequately absorbed by the culture. The unconscious is most active when the ego is least active. This is not a nomen, metaphor. It is a description of something real that happens every night in the architecture of the sleeping mind. The ego, that monitoring, evaluating, managing part of consciousness, weakens its grip as the day ends. It is most dominant in the alert social functioning hours. As you lie down, as the lights go off, as the body stops requiring coordination, the ego begins to relax its governance, and the unconscious, like water that was being held back by a dam, begins to flow. This is why certain thoughts arrive at night that do not arrive in the day, why feelings surface that seem disproportionate to what the day contained. Why the mind goes to particular people, particular memories, particular images that were apparently not in the foreground during the waking hours. They were not absent, they were waiting. The overaware mind experiences this nightly flooding in a specific way. For some, it takes the form of the racing thought, the mind that, released from the structure of the day, accelerates rather than slows. The internal dialogue that was managed into silence during the social hours emerges, unconstrained, in the dark. For others, it is more atmospheric. A mood that arrived with the quiet. A heaviness that has no clear object. A restlessness that is not anxiety in the clinical sense, but something older, the sense of an unfinished conversation held somewhere beneath the surface. And for some, it comes in dreams, which are, in Jung's framework, not noise, not random synaptic firing, but the unconscious mind's most direct available language. Feel the air moving in and out. Jung believed that the unconscious communicates through images and symbols rather than through logic and argument. This is why its messages often feel strange and disproportionate in the light of day. Why a dream about losing your teeth can carry more emotional weight than most waking experiences. Why an image from years ago returns with particular insistence at particular moments. The unconscious is not trying to confuse you. It is speaking in the only dialect it has, and what it is trying to say in a flooding of the nighttime mind, in the images that arrive unbidden, in the emotional weather of the sleepless hours, is something that the daytime consciousness did not find time or space or permission to hear. For the overaware person, this presents a specific challenge, because the overaware mind does not easily let the unconscious speak without immediately trying to interpret it, to categorize it, to assess its meaning and file it appropriately. The thought arrives. The ego immediately responds, "Is this a real concern or an irrational one? Is this something I should act on? What does it say about me that I am thinking this?" And the thought, which was not a logical argument, but an image, a feeling, a fragment of the deeper life, gets translated immediately into the only language the ego knows: words and analysis. And in the translation, something is lost. Jung worked with a patient once who reported the same recurring image in his waking hours. A great dark bird, wings spread, hovering at the edge of his peripheral vision. He dismissed it as anxiety. He tried to reason with it. He researched the psychology of fear responses. The image kept coming. Jung asked him not to explain it, but to sit with it, to close his eyes and allow the image to exist without immediately reaching for interpretation, to let the bird in his mind's eye simply be. The patient reported that the bird, when approached with this quality of attention, landed, that it changed. That, over several sessions, it became something different, not threatening, but enormous, quiet, waiting. What waited at the center of the image was grief, own grief. The kind that had been circling the periphery of his life for years, never permitted to land. The symptom was not the problem. The symptom was the message. And the overaware mind had been so busy interpreting the message that it had never actually received it. Tonight, as the conscious mind softens towards sleep, the unconscious is already moving. The thoughts that rise at the edge of sleep are not your failures. They are not evidence of a mind that cannot rest. They are messages. They are the deeper life asking to be noticed in a way that the daytime ego rarely allows. Not to be solved, not to be filed, just met. And in the meeting, even briefly, something settles. Chapter 14. Dreams as Psychic Correction. Carl Jung spent decades studying dreams, not collecting them as curiosities, not decoding them through a fixed dictionary of symbols, studying them as a clinician studies a patient with sustained, respectful attention. What he found, again and again, was that dreams do not flatter the dreamer. If the ego has moved too far in one direction, become too rigid, too certain, too defended in a particular position, the dream will move in the compensatory direction. It will produce images and experiences that contradict the waking stance, that introduce the thing the consciousness has been avoiding, that present the shadow material, the disowned, unacknowledged qualities in vivid, undeniable form. He called this function psychic correction, the dream system as the psyche's self-regulating mechanism. For the overaware person, this function is both a gift and an irritant, because the dreams of the overaware mind are often dense, frequent, emotionally specific in ways that resist easy assimilation. They carry a charge that lingers into the morning. They produce feelings that the waking mind cannot quite locate in the events of the day before. And the response the overaware mind reaches for, interpretation, analysis, the attempt to decode the symbol, is paradoxically one of the less effective approaches. Not because understanding is wrong, but because understanding is not the same as receiving. Let your body sink a little further into rest. The dreams, when they come tonight, do not require your active participation. Let them come as they will. Jung distinguished between what he called the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious holds the material that has been yours, your forgotten memories, your unprocessed experiences, the accumulation of what your individual life has produced and not yet integrated. The collective unconscious is something larger, something shared. The inherited patterns of the species, the archetypes, the recurring figures, the universal themes that appear in the dreams and myths of people who have never met, and cultures that have never communicated. For the overaware mind, the distinction matters. Because not everything that rises in the night is a personal message. Some of it is older than that. Some of it is the psyche moving in patterns that are older than your particular life. Patterns that belong to the species. To the long story of what it means to be a conscious human being navigating an uncertain world. The over-aware person often finds, over the course of a life that has included genuine reflection, that certain themes recur, not just in dreams, in the kinds of stories they are drawn to. The films and books and pieces of music that catch something specific. The historical figures they find themselves returning to. The mythological images that arrive with unusual weight. These are not coincidences. They are the psyche selecting the material it needs. And Jung's great contribution, the one that distinguished his work from every other depth psychology of his era, was the recognition that these universal patterns, the archetypes, are not just interesting cultural artifacts. They are active, alive, moving in the psyche right now, including yours. The wounded healer, the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, the self. These are not characters in stories. They are structural features of the human psyche. And they communicate, when all the noise of the day has quieted, in the most ancient language available, the language of image, of feeling, of the dream that arrives at 3 a.m. and does not let go. The dream, as psychic correction, does not need to be understood to do its work. This is perhaps the most radical thing Jung suggested. You do not need to analyze your dreams for them to be moving in you. You do not need to know the meaning of the symbol for the symbol to be doing its work of integration and compensation. The simple act of treating the dream seriously, of noting it, of allowing its emotional residue to sit with you in the morning before the day rushes in, is itself a form of reception, a way of telling the unconscious, I heard you, I am here, you can continue. For the overaware mind that has spent years trying to interpret everything, this is a significant adjustment. Not understanding, receiving, not decoding, listening. And in the listening, a different kind of knowing becomes possible. One that comes not from the analysis of the watching self, but from a place beneath it, where the correction was waiting all along. Chapter 15. Archetypes in Sensitive Minds. There is a character who appears in stories across every culture that has ever committed a story to memory. The figure of the seer, the sensitive one. The person who stands at the edge of the village rather than in its center, who knows things before they happen, who carries a weight that the others do not quite understand. In Greek myth, this figure is Cassandra, the one who sees truly and cannot be believed. In Celtic tradition, the thin-skinned one who walks between worlds. In Buddhist teaching, the bodhisattva who postpones their own release from suffering in order to remain in the world with those who still suffer. The archetype of the sensitively aware person is ancient, and Jung's deep insight was that archetypes are not just stories in books. They are active patterns in the psyche, shaping the experience of everyone who falls within their gravitational field. If you have lived much of your life as the one who notices what others miss, who feels what others do not register, who carries the emotional temperature of a room in your body like a barometer carries weather, then you are living inside one of the oldest human archetypes. This does not make you special, or chosen, or superior. But it does mean you are not alone. You have never been alone. You are part of an ancient pattern of human experience that every culture has recognized and every culture has, in some sense, needed. Let your breath deepen just slightly. Let the weight of your history rest for a moment. Jung identified several archetypes that appear with particular regularity in the psychology of overaware people. The first is the shadow, the container of everything the conscious persona has decided is unacceptable. Everything the sensitive person has suppressed in order to be tolerable to others, the anger they did not allow themselves, the need they were ashamed of, the ordinary human selfishness and competitiveness they disowned because it contradicted the identity of the perceptive, empathetic one. The shadow does not disappear. As we touched on earlier, it appears in projection, in the charge on the qualities they dislike in others, in the disproportionate reaction to specific behaviors, in the sudden fury that seems to come from nowhere. For the overaware person, meeting the shadow is both the greatest challenge and the greatest relief available to them, because the shadow, in Jung's model, also contains energy, genuine life force. The parts of the self that were suppressed were not wrong. They were simply socially inconvenient. And reclaiming them, not in the form of destructive behavior, but in the form of psychological ownership, restores something that has been missing. The second archetype that appears with frequency in this territory is the wounded healer. Originally, the figure of Chiron in Greek mythology, the immortal centaur who was accidentally wounded and could not die from his wound, and could not be healed, but who became, through the experience of his unhealed wound, the greatest healer in the ancient world. Jung used this figure to name a quality he noticed in many people drawn to the helping professions, and more broadly, in many overaware people who find themselves instinctively oriented toward others' suffering. The wound makes the healer. The particular quality of attention that the overaware person brings to others' pain comes directly from the experience of their own unresolved pain. The attunement is not learned, it is lived. But the danger, and Jung was very clear about this, is the wounded healer who has never acknowledged the wound, who helps others constantly and receives help from no one, who is so skilled at reading others' needs that they can never quite articulate their own. This is a specific exhaustion, one that the overaware helper knows intimately. And here is the detail that returns to everything else tonight. The archetypes, when recognized, do not trap you in them. They liberate you from the unconscious grip they have had while unrecognized. The sensitive one who discovers they are living inside the archetype of the seer can then choose how to inhabit it. Not as someone who is defined by their sensitivity in ways they cannot control, but as someone who can work with the depth of their perception, care for it as the instrument it is, and rest it when it needs to rest. The wounded healer who acknowledges the wound can then do something the unacknowledged wounded healer cannot. They can accept help. They can allow others to hold what they normally hold alone. These are not small things. They are, in the quiet territory of the overaware life, among the most significant freedoms available. Recognizing the pattern is the beginning of being free of the pattern. Chapter 16. The Inner Critic and the Watchful Self. We have met the inner critic before, tonight, but now we need to look at it more carefully, because it has a specific relationship with the overaware mind that goes beyond simple self-criticism. The inner critic, in the psyche of someone who has lived with heightened awareness, has access to an extraordinary amount of material. It knows how you read the room, it watches the watching, it observes the observation, and then, with the precision of a mind trained on your own standards, it evaluates whether the awareness was deployed correctly, whether the reading was accurate enough, whether the response to what was perceived was appropriate. It is, in a sense, the watcher of the watcher. And this is where the doubled consciousness of the overaware person becomes genuinely difficult, because the self-monitoring does not end with the monitoring of other people and situations. It extends into the monitoring of the self that does the monitoring. You are not just asking, "Did I read that correctly?" You are asking, "Am I the kind of person who reads things correctly? And is my reading of my reading reliable? And what does it mean that I am now asking about the reliability of my reading?" At some point, this recursion has no natural stopping point. It generates its own anxiety, its own doubt, its own material for further analysis. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands rest open. Jung observed something about the inner critic that most of his contemporaries missed. He noticed that the inner critic, when it is most active, is usually speaking in someone else's voice, not your own. Not the voice of your genuine values and honest self-assessment. The voice of a significant person in your early life who had opinions about who you were and how you were doing. A parent who communicated through tone or silence or the particular quality of their approval that your natural self required improvement. A teacher who found your responses inadequate. A peer group that established the terms of acceptability in ways that required you to monitor and adjust. You internalize that voice. And over time, it became so familiar that it began to sound like your own, but it is not. And this distinction between the critic's voice and your own genuine evaluative voice is one of the most transformative recognitions the overaware mind can make. Here is how to begin locating the difference. Your genuine evaluative voice, the one that is actually yours, is curious rather than prosecutorial. It notices something and asks, "What is happening here?" It is interested in understanding. It allows uncertainty. The critic's voice is prosecutorial. It has already decided the verdict before the examination begins. Its questions are not real questions. They are accusations wearing a question mark. Why did you say it that way? Spoken with genuine curiosity is inquiry. Why did you say it that way? Spoken with a particular tone already contains the judgment, "You said it wrong." The feeling in the body is different for each. The genuine voice lands in the chest, in the area of curiosity and engagement. The critical voice lands higher, in the throat, in the jaw, in the slight tightening that signals the presence of threat. The watchful self, the deepest form of awareness available to the overaware person, is neither the critic nor the performer. It is the one that watches both. It is the part that can observe the critic running and recognize it as a pattern rather than a truth. That can witness the persona being adjusted for a room and recognize it as a choice rather than an identity. This is what Jung meant by the observing ego at its best. Not the ego that is lost in its own material. The ego that has gained just enough perspective to see itself. And from that perspective, something becomes possible that was not possible before. The inner critic can be heard without being obeyed. The self-monitoring can continue without becoming the primary reality. The awareness that has been turned against the self can be turned slowly into something more like companionship. Not tonight, necessarily, not in a single realization, but across the long, quiet work of a life that has decided to pay attention to itself with something other than judgment. That work is already in you. It is the reason you are still here, still listening, still attending to this conversation in the dark. Chapter 17. Self-worth beneath the persona. There is a question that has been alive in you longer than you have had words for it. It has worn different faces across the decades. In childhood, it was, "Do they like me?" In adolescence, "Do I belong?" In early adulthood, "Am I good enough at this to be taken seriously?" And in the middle years, the years of accumulated achievement and acknowledged competence, and still the question, "Do I matter?" Not in a dramatic sense, not with existential despair, just quietly, underneath everything. a baseline uncertainty about whether your worth is genuinely established or whether it is contingent, always, on the next performance. Carl Jung spent considerable attention on what he called the inflation of the persona, the way in which the social mask, when it becomes too identified with the self, begins to substitute for genuine self-worth. Because the persona succeeds. It is well-liked, well-regarded, professionally effective. It generates external validation in regular quantities. And the self that wears it begins to confuse the validation of the persona with the worth of the actual self. And this is where the particular vulnerability of the over-aware person lives. Because the over-aware person is usually very good at the persona. They have spent years calibrating it. They read rooms accurately enough to present the version of themselves that the room requires. They are perceptive enough to anticipate what is needed and conscientious enough to provide it. The persona receives approval. And somewhere beneath the persona, the actual self asks, "But would they approve of me if they knew what was actually here?" The unexplained anxiety, the self-monitoring that never turns off, the need for solitude that people who only know the persona would find surprising, the sensitivity that gets managed in public but overwhelms in private. Feel the weight of your body, just the weight, just the rest. Jung said something that takes some time to fully land. He said that the development of a robust, functional persona is not the goal of a fully lived psychological life. It is a necessary phase, an important one, but a phase. The goal, what he called the second half of life's task, is the development of an inner sense of self that does not depend on the persona's success for its stability. A sense of worth that is not contingent on the next performance, the next validation, the next evidence that the mask has been well received. This is not the same as confidence in the ordinary sense. Confidence can still be performance. It can still be dependent on external conditions. What Jung pointed toward was something quieter, more foundational. A relationship with your own existence that did not require justification through external approval. The work toward this is not a technique. It is a turning, a gradual, sometimes reluctant turning of the attention from the outer evidence, what others see, what they say, how the persona is being received, toward the inner reality that exists regardless of all of that. The reality of what you actually experience, what you actually feel, what you actually value, not because it is socially sanctioned, but because it is genuinely yours. This inner reality, which the persona has spent years carefully managing and partially concealing, is, in Jung's view, the only foundation that actual self-worth can be built on. Not because the external world does not matter, it does. But because a worth that lives only in the external world is hostage to the external world. And the external world is not ultimately a stable place to store something as essential as your sense of your own value. The overaware person has often known this, in theory, for a long time. They have read about it, they understand the architecture. They can articulate the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic worth with fluency and precision. And they are still, at 2 a.m., wondering, because understanding the map is not the same as arriving at the destination. The arrival happens through different means, through the accumulation of experiences in which the actual self, not the persona, but what lives beneath it, was present and was not rejected. Through relationships that can hold the raw version. Through creative work that expresses the unexpressed. Through moments of genuine solitude in which you discover that the person you are alone with is actually bearable, is actually worth knowing. These discoveries are not made once and kept permanently. They are made and forgotten and found again over years. But they accumulate. And what accumulates slowly beneath the persona is something more solid than approval. It is the beginning of knowing yourself as the ground rather than the performance. Chapter 18, Loneliness in the Overaware Life. There is a specific kind of loneliness that does not respond to company. You can be at a dinner table with people who love you, in the middle of laughter, held in warmth, and feel it, not as an intrusion, as an undertone, as the faint awareness that even here, even in this, there is a part of you that remains at a slight remove. That is not fully inside the moment. It is not the loneliness of the unloved. It is the loneliness of the profoundly individuated. Jung identified this as one of the inevitable features of a highly developed inner life. He was not romanticizing it. He was noting, with the particular honesty of someone who felt it himself, that a deep inner world is both a richness and a kind of solitude, because the inner world is by definition interior. It cannot be fully shared. No matter how articulately you describe your inner experience, something remains in the translation. The map is not the territory. The words are not the feeling. And for the overaware person, the interior is vast. It contains not just their own experience, but the accumulated impressions of everyone around them. The emotional residue of every room they have occupied. The absorbed atmospheres, the sensed undercurrents, the unspoken meanings they carry home without meaning to. All of this lives inside, churning, seeking integration, sometimes seeking simply to be witnessed. But there is often no one to witness it, not because of a failure of connection, but because the kind of witnessing required, the full, attentive, non-evaluative presence of another person who can hold both the depth and the complexity without flinching or simplifying, is genuinely rare. And the overaware person knows how rare it is, which sometimes makes them stop seeking it entirely. Let your breath move slowly. let the stillness hold you for a moment. The loneliness of the overaware life is also, in part, the loneliness of not being believed. Not in a dramatic sense, not disbelieved about facts, disbelieved about the texture of experience. When you describe how something felt, the weight of that particular silence, the shift in someone's voice that signaled the beginning of a withdrawal, the undercurrent of something unresolved in a room that felt, to everyone else, entirely normal, you often encounter a gentle, well-meaning version of, "I am sure it was not as bad as that," or "You are probably reading too much into it," or "You worry too much." And over years, those gentle dismissals accumulate. They teach you to stop describing the texture of your experience, to curate what you share, to keep the full depth of what you notice largely to yourself, which makes the interior larger and the external world more distant. Jung wrote in a letter late in his life that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you, or from holding certain views that others find inadmissible. He knew this loneliness personally. He lived it across the years of intellectual exile that followed his break with Freud. He lived it in the isolation of his inner world, which was simply too strange, too vast, too mythologically inhabited to be easily shared. What sustained him was not, ultimately, other people. Though he had meaningful relationships, what sustained him was the sense of being accompanied by the inner life itself, by the figures of the unconscious that he had stopped fearing and started engaging, by the myths and archetypes that gave his particular experience a context larger than his own biography. He was, in a sense, never alone. Because the inner world, fully inhabited, is always populated. This does not resolve the loneliness of the overaware life, but it does reframe it. The solitude that belongs to the person of deep interior experience is not necessarily a wound. It is, in part, a natural consequence of the territory, of having a self that extends further inward than the social world can follow. And the work, not the cure, but the work, is not to eliminate the solitude. It is to learn to inhabit it without suffering. To treat the interior world as a companion rather than a sentence. To discover in the quiet that tonight offers that the part of you that has always been watching, that has been there, alert and attending, through all the loneliness and all the performance and all the years of carrying what could not be shared, is itself a form of presence. You have never been without company. You have been accompanied by your own depth all this time. Chapter 19, The Wound of Seeing Too Much. There is a version of this conversation that would say, sensitivity is a gift. Awareness is an asset. Your ability to feel more and notice more is something to celebrate. And there is truth in that. Real truth. But tonight we are also going to sit with the other part. The part that does not get celebrated. The wound of seeing too much. Because there is a specific pain that belongs to the overaware life that is not adequately addressed by affirmations about sensitivity being a superpower. The pain of encountering the gap between what you perceive and what you can change. Between the awareness of how things are and the absence of any clear mechanism for making them otherwise, you can see that someone you love is suffering, and the specific texture of their suffering with a clarity they may not have about themselves, and you cannot fix it. They may not even want your perception. They may find your seeing intrusive or too precise, or simply more than they are ready for. You can feel the emotional temperature of a situation shift in a direction that will produce difficulty, and you cannot stop it. You can only watch it unfold. You can perceive your own patterns with unusual accuracy, the place where the fear lives, the mechanism of the defense, the origin of the reaction, and still find yourself, despite all that perception, in the same place. Doing the thing you understood. This is the wound that seeing too much can produce. Not ignorance, its opposite. The pain of being highly informed about a reality you cannot control. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath arrive on its own. Jung was very clear about something that can be easy to miss in his work. He did not believe that insight alone was curative. He was, in fact, skeptical of the idea that understanding your problem was the same as resolving it. He had seen too many patients who could explain their neurosis with perfect accuracy and were not, for that reason, freed from it. He said the psyche changes not primarily through understanding, but through experience, through the lived encounter with a different way of being, through the new experience that provides the nervous system and the deep self with information that contradicts the old conclusion. This matters for the overaware person because the overaware person's natural response to suffering is more insight, more analysis, a better, more precise understanding of what is happening and why. And there is a place for that. Understanding has value, but understanding alone will not close the wound of seeing too much. What begins to close it is something different. It is the experience of being seen in return, of having the depth of your perception acknowledged rather than dismissed, of being in the presence of someone or something, some practice, some creative work, some inner encounter that does not require you to manage your awareness down to a socially acceptable level. Dostoevsky, who understood the overaware consciousness from the inside, whose characters are almost universally people who feel too much, see too clearly, and suffer extravagantly for both, wrote something in one of his letters that applies here. He had stood before a firing squad at 28. They had given him the experience of total imminent death before the last moment reprieve. And what he wrote about afterward was not the fear, it was what happened to his perception in those seconds. He said he saw everything with a clarity that was almost painful. The light on the buildings across the square, the cold air, the faces of the men around him, everything ordinary rendered extraordinary by the possibility of its loss. The overaware mind lives at a lower intensity in something like this state much of the time. not because it is facing death, but because the heightened perceptual system does not distinguish between the signal and the noise the way other minds do. It takes everything in, and everything it takes in carries weight. The wound of seeing too much is real. It is not self-indulgent. It is not excessive sensitivity in need of toughening. It is the price of the instrument. And the question is not how to stop the seeing. It cannot be stopped. It is not, at its core, something you chose. The question is how to carry the seeing without being consumed by it. How to be the one who notices and still rest. How to hold the weight of awareness without making the carrying the whole of your life. That question, this conversation is slowly answering. Chapter 20. Complexes that disturb peace. Carl Jung borrowed the word complex from medicine. A complex, in his usage, is a cluster of emotionally charged material, memories, feelings, images, beliefs that has formed around a particular psychological theme and that operates, to a significant degree, independently of conscious control. The key word there is independently. A complex is not something you consciously activate. It activates in response to triggers, circumstances, words, tones, faces, situations that resemble, in some deep structural way, the original experiences around which the complex formed. And when it activates, it brings its full charge with it. An emotional response that may be disproportionate to the current situation. A behavior that you might, in retrospect, describe as not like yourself. A sudden certainty or sudden fear or sudden need that arrived with an urgency that surprised you. You have felt this. The reaction that was bigger than the situation warranted. The person who triggered something specific and particular in you, not just irritation or sadness in a general sense, but a very particular flavor of feeling that seemed to have its own history, its own weight, its own internal logic. The dream that arrived with an intensity that the day before it could not account for. The moment when you said something you had not planned to say, in a tone you did not intend, and heard the words leaving your mouth as if from a slight distance. That slight distance is the complex speaking, and the experience of observing your own reaction with the recognition that something autonomous has taken the wheel, briefly but definitely, is one of the most unsettling features of the overaware life. Let your breath come a little softer. Let the body settle. Because the over-aware person who has worked hard to understand their patterns, who has done the reading and the reflecting and the examining, still gets activated, still finds themselves ambushed by the complex, even when they can name the complex with precision. This is not failure. This is the nature of complexes. They are not dissolved by being understood. Understanding is necessary, but not sufficient. The complex formed at a level of experience that precedes language. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of feeling and response that run beneath the articulate, analytical self. And it changes very slowly over years, not through analysis alone, but through a different kind of attention, through the willingness to sit with the activation rather than immediately explaining it. To feel the charge of the complex without immediately translating it into narrative. To let the body process what the mind has been describing. There is a modern therapeutic description of this that is worth knowing, even without the clinical language. When we are activated by a complex, when the old pattern takes hold, the nervous system enters a state that is, at the physiological level, closer to the original threatening situation than to the current safe one. The body is in a different time than the mind. The mind says, "This is 2026, I am safe." This is not then. The body says, the feeling is the same. The response is the same. And the response happens. The integration, the closing of the gap between the body's time and the mind's time happens through something Jung called holding the tension, not resolving the feeling prematurely, not explaining it back into manageability, sitting with the fullness of what has been activated, with as much self-compassion as can be summoned, until the charge, which is not infinite, begins naturally to release. This is the slow work, not dramatic, not linear, not completed in a single session or a single year, but real. And the overaware person who has been dealing with the activations of their complexes across a lifetime of careful self-observation has already been doing this work, even without the map to describe it. The noticing has always been the beginning of the integration, the awareness, even when it exhausted you, was always pointed in the right direction. Chapter 21. The search for inner balance, Jung called it individuation. It is the word he used for the lifelong process of becoming more fully who you actually are, not who the persona requires you to be, not who the complex pushes you to become, not who the early environment taught you to perform. The word itself suggests something biological, something that happens in its own time, through its own internal logic, in the way that a plant moves toward light, not a project, not a technique, not something you achieve and then possess, a process, ongoing, incomplete, by design, for the whole of a life. The search for inner balance in Jung's framework is not the search for the absence of conflict. It is not the elimination of shadow, or the silencing of the inner critic, or the resolution of every complex into smoothness. It is something more interesting than that. It is the capacity to hold opposites without being destroyed by them, to be both the observing self and the experiencing self, without one annihilating the other, to contain both the shadow and the persona, the depth and the function, the wound and the wisdom, without any of them becoming the only truth. Feel the weight of your body resting, the breath moving, slow and even. This sounds abstract. Let us make it concrete. The overaware person searching for inner balance is not looking for a version of themselves that no longer worries too much or reads too many layers into things. That version does not exist. They are looking for a way to be the person they are, aware, sensitive, deep, prone to complexity, without that person being a source of suffering to themselves. The balance is not between the overaware self and some calmer, simpler self they wish they were. The balance is internal, between the watching and the resting, between the analysis and the feeling, between the outward orientation and the inward one, between the giving of awareness to others and the receiving of something, rest, gentleness, understanding, back. There is a scene from a garden that belongs here. Imagine a garden with many cultivated sections, well tended, carefully arranged, beautiful in its own way, and in one corner, overgrown, dark. The gardener has never quite gone there, not from fear exactly, just from the momentum of always attending to the other sections first, the better lit ones, the ones that produce something visible. In the overgrown corner, something unexpected. Not only weeds, flowers the gardener thought were lost. Older ones, less cultivated, but with a kind of wildness that the arranged sections lack. The inner balance is not achieved by clearing the overgrown corner into the same order as the rest. It is achieved by the gardener learning to visit it, to sit in it sometimes, to let its wildness exist alongside the order without needing to resolve the contradiction, the shadow, the complex, the ancient, uncultivated parts of the self. They are not the enemy of balance. They are part of what balance, honestly arrived at, must contain. Jung observed that the people who achieved the deepest integration in their lives, who seemed to radiate something he could only call wholeness, were not the people who had resolved every conflict or who had achieved every conflict. Goal. They were the people who had stopped running from the parts of themselves they found inconvenient, who had turned around with whatever courage was available and looked. Not to master what they found, not to eliminate it, to acknowledge it, to say, I see you. You are part of me. I am not identical to you, but I am also not at war with you. That acknowledgement, quiet, unglamorous, repeated over years, is the engine of the individuation process. And the over-aware mind, for all the exhaustion it carries, is particularly well suited to this work. Because the awareness that has been a burden is also, when turned inward with compassion rather than judgment, exactly the instrument that individuation requires. The search for inner balance is not a destination, but tonight, in the quiet, you are already somewhere on the path. The fact that you are here, still attending, still willing to look, is not nothing. It is, in fact, almost everything. Chapter 22. Individuation and Emotional Healing. The healing that Jung offered was not the healing of repair. He was not interested in returning people to some prior state, some pre-wounded version of themselves that existed before the sensitivity developed, before the complexes formed, before the awareness became what it is. He did not believe in that version. Or rather, he did not believe it was the goal. The goal he described was something more radical and more humble at once: the healing of integration, the process of bringing what has been unconscious into consciousness, what has been split into relation, what has been exiled into belonging. Not wholeness in the sense of perfection, wholeness in the sense of nothing excluded. Emotional healing in this framework does not look like the disappearance of difficult feeling. It looks like the end of the war against difficult feeling, because the overaware person's relationship to their own emotional experience is often a conflicted one. They feel deeply, and they also evaluate their feeling. They assess whether the feeling is appropriate, proportionate, warranted by the circumstances. They ask whether the sensitivity they are experiencing is genuine perception or nervous system legacy. And in the space of all that evaluation, the feeling itself, the raw, pre-analytical thing that was trying to be felt, often does not get to complete itself. The healing begins when the evaluation pauses, when the feeling is allowed to arrive without being immediately assessed. Let your body rest fully. Let the breath come exactly as it wants to. This is not an instruction to abandon discernment. The discernment of the overaware mind is real and valuable. It will still be there when the feeling has moved through. It is an instruction, a gentle one, to hold the discernment in one hand and the feeling in the other, not to let either annihilate the other. To be the one who thinks and the one who feels simultaneously in the same moment, in the same body. That simultaneity is what Jung meant when he talked about the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold two opposing things at once and to produce from that holding something new, something that was not available from either side alone. The person who came to therapy and was asked, "What would you say to yourself if you spoke the way you speak to your best friend?" Who opened their mouth to answer and realized they had never tried, who discovered in the silence of that realization that there was a whole territory of self-relating they had never inhabited. That realization is not the healing, but it is the door. It is the moment when the person who has spent a lifetime extending awareness and care to others turns slightly, tentatively, curiously toward themselves, not with the inner critic's precision, with the warmth they would extend to someone they actually love. Emotional healing in the individuation process is not linear. It does not proceed from wound to resolution in any clean arc. It moves in spirals. The same material returns at different depths across different years. Each time it returns, you are not back at the beginning. You are meeting the same truth from a higher position on the spiral, with more capacity, with more tools, with more of yourself available to receive what is there. This is why the healing conversation is never finished. But it is also why it is never wasted. Consider the person who spent years in therapy understanding their attachment patterns, who could articulate with clarity and precision exactly how their early experience of inconsistent care had produced an adult who monitored relationships for the early signals of withdrawal, who understood the mechanism completely, and who still in new relationships found the old monitoring beginning. They returned to this material not because the therapy had failed, but because understanding is not the same as transformation. And transformation happens through a different process, through the accumulation of lived experiences that give the system new data. The new data was, they stayed. The feared withdrawal did not happen. And then it did not happen again. And then, gradually, the monitoring relaxed. Not because it was argued out of existence, because it received from actual experience the update it had been waiting for. This is the slow, often unglamorous, always real process of emotional healing in the Jungian sense. Not insight as the final destination, insight as the map that helps you find the experiences that do the actual work. Every time you turn toward yourself with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, even briefly, even imperfectly, something accumulated. Some small evidence was added to the case that the self is worth attending to, and the case over years becomes compelling. The self, attended to with compassion, does not fall apart. It expands. Chapter 23. Withdrawal, silence, and protection. For most of your life, you have probably needed more silence than you were given, more solitude, more time between the social and the personal, more space in which to set down what you absorbed in the world and sort through it without anyone else's needs present. And most of your life you have probably apologized for this need, at least internally, called it antisocial or fragile or selfish, measured yourself against people who seem to move through the social world without requiring recovery time, and found yourself, by that measure, deficient. It is not a deficiency. It is the maintenance requirement of a high sensitivity instrument. Jung was an introvert, not in the casual sense of preferring quiet evenings at home. In the technical sense, he himself defined someone whose energy moves primarily inward, who is recharged by solitude and depleted by sustained social engagement, and whose richest experience is always the interior one. He wrote about this with unusual candor for a man of his professional standing. He described the tower he built at Bollingen, on a lake in Switzerland, where he spent extended periods alone. No electricity, no phone, simple meals, long walks. Time to think without the structure of professional life organizing his attention. He went there not to escape the world, but to return to himself. To the part of himself that the professional persona, the brilliant, formidable, internationally known Carl Jung, inevitably obscured, the tower was not luxury, it was maintenance. Let your breath slow. Let the silence of this moment be what it is. The protection that silence offers the overaware mind is not only from external stimulus, though it is that. It is protection from the continuous, involuntary absorption of other people's emotional states. Because the person with a highly calibrated attunement system does not get to choose whether to register the emotional weather of a room. The registration happens automatically. The information arrives without being requested, and it is stored in the body, in the nervous system, in the particular quality of fatigue that follows prolonged social engagement. Silence and solitude are not withdrawal from the world. They are the time in which all of that absorbed material can be processed, in which the impressions can be sorted, the emotions metabolized, the boundary between what belongs to you and what you took on from someone else re-established. Without that processing time, the absorbed material accumulates, the emotional storage fills, the sensitivity that functions well when regularly maintained begins to function poorly, not because the instrument is broken, because it has not been serviced. There is something worth saying about the guilt that often accompanies the overaware person's need for withdrawal. The guilt is usually a version of, other people do not need this much. Therefore, I am weaker or less capable than other people. This reasoning contains a category error. Other people are not processing the same amount of information that you are. They are not absorbing the emotional subtext of every interaction. They are not carrying the atmospheric residue of a day full of human contact in the particular, sustained way that you carry it. Saying they need less recovery time is like saying a sprinter needs less rest than a long-distance runner. True, perhaps, but not a reflection of weakness. A reflection of the nature of the activity. The withdrawal is also, at its best, not passive. It is in the silence that the inner life has its most direct access to consciousness. The dreams remembered more clearly. The insights that surface in the quiet moment on a walk. The creative impulse that requires not stimulation, but space. Jung called the unconscious generous. He said it does not withhold. It offers constantly. But it offers in a voice that can only be heard when the other voice is quiet. The protection of silence is also the gift of silence. The overaware mind, given proper rest, does not become less perceptive. It becomes more accurately perceptive. The noise and the signal can be distinguished more clearly. What belongs to you and what you absorbed can be sorted more precisely. And what emerges from the quiet, the genuine insight, the real feeling, the authentic creative impulse is more truly yours than anything that arrived in the noise. Tonight is that silence. This is not rest from your inner life. This is rest inside it. Chapter 24. Love and the Fear of Exposure. The overaware person in love is a particular kind of vulnerable, not because they love more intensely than others, though they may, but because the awareness that makes them perceptive in all other domains also makes them perceptive in the most intimate ones. They notice the shift in their partner's mood before their partner has noticed it themselves. They read the undertone of a sentence. They feel the quality of a silence. They know, often with uncomfortable precision, when something is not quite right before it has been named, before it can be discussed, before the other person has any words for it. And they are aware, always, that they are this way, that the perception itself can be destabilizing. That seeing too clearly can feel, to the person being seen, like an intrusion. This creates a particular tension in love. The over-aware person is capable of extraordinary attunement, of being genuinely, deeply seen and genuinely, deeply seeing, of the kind of intimacy that people who are less aware sometimes cannot access. But the very capacity for depth becomes the source of the fear, because if you can see others this clearly, can feel their emotional states, before they can articulate them, can sense the undercurrent beneath the surface of what is being said, then presumably others can see you this way too. And what you know is in you, the complexity, the contradictions, the shadow, the need, suddenly feels very visible. The fear of exposure is not the fear of being known in a general sense. It is the fear of being known specifically. The fear that the part of you that is rawer and less composed and less intelligent than the persona would, when seen, produce withdrawal, disappointment. The particular kind of leaving that comes not with drama, but with a slow, quiet withdrawal of attention. Feel your breath. Nothing is required of you right now. Jung wrote with care about what he called the relatedness of the feeling type, the person for whom connection is the primary mode of being in the world, who reaches understanding through relationship rather than through solitary analysis, whose inner life is, in a sense, completed by the presence of another. This is not dependency in a pathological sense. It is an orientation, a way of knowing, and for the person of this orientation, the fear of exposure is not irrational. It is proportionate to the depth of what connection means to them. But here is what Jung observed across decades of working with people who lived in this territory. The thing that is most feared to be seen, the raw, more complicated, less polished interior self, is almost always the thing that, when seen, produces the deepest connection. Not always, not universally. Relationships are not guaranteed safe containers, but the connection that is built on the persona alone, on the performance of ease, competence, and emotional containment, is a connection that can only go as deep as the persona. And the persona, for all its social utility, is not where anyone lives. The depth is inside. And the depth is where the real relationship happens, when it happens at all. The fear of exposure is, at its root, the fear of discovering that your inside self, the one that feels too much and sees too much and needs more silence than is socially sanctioned, is simply too much. Too much to be tolerable. Too much to be lovable. And what Jung's whole body of work argues, quietly and persistently, is that this fear is based on a conclusion formed without adequate evidence. A conclusion formed, usually, in contexts that were not safe enough to test it. The evidence that the actual self is too much for love was gathered in conditions that were not representative of all love. And the test, the careful, gradual, chosen test of allowing yourself to be known a little more than feels entirely safe, is the only way to update the conclusion. Not tonight. Not in a single act of courage. Over time, incrementally. With a kind of slowness that actually builds something sturdy. But here, in the quiet, it is worth letting the possibility land that the self beneath the persona, aware, sensitive, complicated, sometimes overwhelming to itself, is precisely the self that is capable of the depth of love it is also capable of receiving. The wound and the gift are the same instrument, and it has never been too much. It has been, all this time, exactly the right amount of itself. Chapter 25. Meaning for the Restless Soul. There is a particular hunger that the overaware person carries, not for achievement in the ordinary sense. They have often achieved. Not for comfort, necessarily, though they are not immune to wanting it. It is a hunger for meaning, for the sense that the depth of their experience is in service of something, that the capacity to feel this much, to perceive this clearly, to carry this weight of awareness, that all of it points somewhere, adds up to something, is not simply a private condition, but a participation in something larger. Viktor Frankl, who emerged from unimaginable conditions with the conviction that meaning is the primary human need, wrote something that the over-aware person tends to feel the truth of immediately. He observed that suffering, by itself, produces nothing. Suffering is not ennobling, but suffering in the context of a meaning, a purpose, a contribution, a story that gives the pain a function, transforms, not eliminates, transforms. The overaware mind, with all its depth and sensitivity, often struggles to locate meaning in a way that feels commensurate with the weight of what it carries, because the obvious meanings, career achievement, social contribution, religious or philosophical frameworks, can feel insufficient, too small, too external to the particular interior life that is always underneath the external structure, pressing, and the pressing itself becomes the question. Not just, what does my life mean? But what does this particular quality of being in the world, this way of experiencing everything at such close range, what is this for? Let your breath find its own natural depth. Let the weight of your body rest completely. Jung's answer to this question was not religious in the conventional sense, but it was not secular either. He said that the deepest meaning available to the overaware, individuating person is the meaning of becoming more fully who they are, of completing the process that the psyche is already engaged in, of bringing more of what has been unconscious into the light of consciousness. Not because consciousness itself is the goal, but because the more complete a person becomes, the more they have integrated of their shadow, reclaimed of their exiled qualities, made peace with their complexity, the more genuinely available they are to others. The healed wound becomes the site of real understanding. The integrated shadow becomes the source of genuine compassion for the shadows of others. The depth of inner experience, metabolized and owned, becomes the capacity for real connection rather than the barrier to it. There is a thread we planted near the beginning of tonight. The question of what the overaware mind's awareness is actually for. Here is where it returns. Here is where the thread resolves. The awareness is not punishment. It is not a flaw of construction. It is not a burden you were given without purpose. It is the instrument through which the work of individuation is done. And individuation, in Jung's framework, is not merely personal. It is, in the most literal sense, a contribution. Every person who undertakes the genuine work of becoming more fully themselves, of facing the shadow, integrating the complexity, moving toward wholeness rather than toward mere performance, does something that radiates outward, not loudly, not publicly, but in the quality of their presence, in the depth of their relationships, in the way they inhabit their corner of the world. The restless soul that has spent decades searching for meaning in achievement, in external validation, in the next understanding or the next insight or the next level of clarity. That soul is already, through the very fact of its searching, doing the work that meaning requires. There is a moment that many overaware people recognize somewhere in the long middle of their lives. It arrives not with drama. It arrives usually in an ordinary situation, a quiet afternoon, a conversation with someone they have known for years, a view of something completely ordinary, a tree, a window, a child's face that suddenly registers with unusual weight. In the moment, they are not thinking about meaning. They are not searching. They are simply there. And there is something present that is difficult to name. Not happiness exactly, not peace in any passive sense. Something more like alignment. the sense of being exactly the right size for the life they are in. No bigger and no smaller. That moment, however brief, however quickly the mind returns to its usual activity, is what meaning feels like when it is not being pursued. It is what happens when the instrument, finally at rest, simply sounds. The meaning was not elsewhere, it was here, in this, the willingness to remain engaged with your own life, to refuse the comfortable numbness that is available, to keep the awareness alive. Even when the awareness exhausts, you have never stopped searching. That is not restlessness in the pathological sense. That is a soul that cares enough about its own existence to keep asking the question. And that in Jung's world, in Frankl's world, in the quiet territory of every wisdom tradition that has thought carefully about the inner life, is meaning enough. Chapter 26. When awareness becomes wisdom. There is a moment, often it arrives, gradually, without announcement, when the awareness that has been a burden begins to change its quality, not to lessen, not to simplify, but to settle. To stop being the thing that is happening to you and to start being the thing that you are doing. This is the transition that Jung had in mind when he described the second half of life. The first half, roughly the period of building, establishing, developing the persona and the competencies and the external life, is characterized by the ego's ascendance, the consciousness pushing outward, trying to make something of itself in the world. The second half, which for many people begins in their 40s or 50s, but for the overaware person often begins earlier, is characterized by the turn inward, by the awareness beginning to work not in service of outward achievement, but in service of inward integration. When awareness becomes wisdom, it is still the same instrument, but it is being used differently. Wisdom is not cleverness accumulated. It is the quality of presence that emerges when the self has stopped trying to be something and has begun simply to be. The wise person is not without complexity. They still have their shadow, their complexes, their patterns. They are still capable of being activated, of falling into old responses, of missing something they should have seen. But they hold all of this differently, with a kind of companionable honesty, a willingness to say, yes, this is what I am, not all of it, but this part, yes, and I can be this without it being the last word. There is a particular expression of this that the overaware person often reaches somewhere in the long middle of their life. They stop explaining themselves, not because they have given up on being understood, but because they have begun to understand themselves well enough that the explanation feels less urgent. The need for external validation of the internal experience decreases, not because the internal experience has diminished, but because it has become more clearly their own. This is not cynicism. It is not withdrawal from connection. It is the particular freedom of someone who has, through years of honest self-engagement, arrived at a kind of self-trust. Let your breath settle into its own rhythm. Let the quiet be generous. In memories, dreams, reflections, Jung's autobiographical account of his own inner life, he describes a quality of his later years that is worth spending a moment with. He writes about sitting at Bollingen at his lake, watching the light change on the water, and of having, in those moments, a sense of participation in something that extended beyond his individual life. A sense of being a link in a chain, part of something that was not completed in him but moved through him. He was not a young man when he wrote this. He had been through the great ruptures, the break with Freud, the years of inner turmoil, the long work of building an original body of thought. He had integrated enormous amounts of his own shadow material, engaged with the depths of his own unconscious, lived through the full arc of an extraordinarily interior life. And what remained at the end of all of that was not certainty, not answers, something simpler and more durable. The sense of being here, fully here, in this moment, in this body, in this particular span of consciousness that was his for this particular time. That presence, cultivated through decades of honest self-engagement, is what awareness, finally metabolized, produces. Not more seeing, but a different quality of being with what is seen. Not less sensitivity, but a different relationship to what is felt. The instrument still vibrates, but the one who holds it has steadied. Chapter 27, The Slow Work of Integration. Everything we have talked about tonight comes down at its most practical to this. The work is slow, not as a discouragement, as a relief. Because the overaware mind, which tends toward urgency in its self-improvement projects, sometimes reaches for transformation as if it were an event, a realization powerful enough to reorganize the self, a session or a book or a conversation that breaks through and changes the fundamental architecture. These moments happen. They are real. Jung experienced them himself in the long crisis years of his midlife. But they are not the mechanism. They are punctuation in a sentence that is written over years. The mechanism is repetition. Not the repetition of the complex, running its automatic pattern. The repetition of the choice to meet the complex when it runs with something other than its own logic. To notice the activation and not be entirely inside it. To feel the critic's voice and not identify with it completely. To sense the projection and to ask, even briefly, what is in me that is speaking here? These choices, made imperfectly and regularly across the long stretch of an ordinary life, are the integration. And if your mind has been drifting tonight, that is perfectly fine. Come back, gently. We are still here. Let the next breath carry you back. Jung described something he called the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold two opposing forces in tension long enough to produce something that contains and transcends both. The tension between the conscious ego and the unconscious, between the persona and the shadow, between the watching self and the feeling self. When that tension is held, not resolved prematurely, not collapsed into one side or the other, but genuinely held, something new becomes possible. Not a synthesis in a logical sense, more like an evolution, a third thing that was not available from either side alone. The slow work of integration is the practice of holding that tension day after day. In the ordinary interactions, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the dreams when they come, in the recognition of the pattern as the pattern begins to run. There is a very old story about a student who travels a great distance to ask a sage one question. The student climbs a mountain path in the evening, arrives at a simple dwelling, and finds an old person sitting in the dark. He asks his question. The sage says nothing for a very long time. The student waits, uncomfortable in the silence, then rises to leave, thinking the sage has nothing to offer. At the door, the sage speaks for the first time, not with an answer, with a different question. The student stands in the doorway for a long moment, then sits back down. He will be there for a while, because the answer, it turns out, does not live in the asking. It lives in the sitting with the question long enough to discover what the question was actually asking. The slow work of integration requires exactly this quality of patience, not with the world, not primarily with others, with yourself. The willingness to sit with the question of who you are, including the parts that are not yet resolved, the shadow material still waiting, the complexes still occasionally running, the awareness still sometimes exhausting, and to remain curious rather than condemning, to be in process without treating the process as failure, to be, in other words, as generous with your own becoming as you are at your best with others. The slow work has been happening all along. Tonight is part of it. And you are, as you always have been, exactly where the work is. Chapter 28, Making Peace with the Shadow. The shadow is not what you think it is, or rather, it is not only what you think it is. Most people, when they encounter Jung's concept of the shadow for the first time, understand it as the container of the dark qualities, the anger, the selfishness, the destructive impulses, the shameful desires. The worst of what we might be, kept out of sight, and it does contain those things. But it contains something else as well. Something that many people find once they begin to look more surprising. It contains the unlived life, the capacities that were suppressed not because they were harmful, but because they were inconvenient. The joy that was too loud, the ambition that seemed indecorous, the creativity that was set aside because more practical needs called, the playfulness that was outgrown too early, the anger that was legitimate and was suppressed because the family could not hold it. The shadow is not only the worst of you, It is also the parts of you that were put away for safekeeping in environments that could not receive them. Making peace with the shadow begins with this recognition. What is down there is not all threatening. Much of it is simply unlived. Waiting. Not to be acted on indiscriminately, not to be unleashed, but to be acknowledged, to be recognized as belonging to you, to be gradually, carefully reintegrated into the fullness of who you are. Let your breath come very slowly. Let your body feel the ground beneath you. For the overaware person, the shadow often contains something specific. It contains the permission to be ordinary. Because the overaware person has often built their identity partly on the capacity to be extraordinary, to see more, to feel more, to operate at a depth that others do not access. And this identity, for all its genuine basis in reality, casts a shadow. The ordinary is in the shadow. The permission to not know something, to not read the room, to be confused, uncalibrated, imprecise, to have a feeling that has no philosophical dimension, to rest without productivity, to exist for a few hours without the awareness running at full capacity. The peace with the shadow is made slowly, in small encounters, in the moment when you catch the projection, when you recognize that the quality you are reacting to in another person is a quality that belongs to you, suppressed, and you do not immediately explain it away. You sit with it for a moment. You say, "Ah, there you are." In the dream that presents something you do not want to see, and you stay with the image rather than immediately replacing it with interpretation. In the small acts of reclamation, the anger expressed appropriately in a situation that warranted it. The ordinary day allowed to be ordinary. The delight in something uncomplicated, unguilted, simply enjoyed. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less the shadow is embodied in conscious life, the darker and denser it becomes. What he meant was not that we should make all our shadow qualities public, or that we should act on every suppressed impulse. He meant that what is not acknowledged accumulates pressure. The unmet grows louder. The exiled organizes in the dark and eventually makes itself known through the back door of projection, of activation, of the feeling that something is wrong, but nothing specific can be named. The peace with the shadow is the opening of the front door. Not all the way, not all at once, just enough to let in some light. Just enough to let something breathe that has been held too long in the dark. And to discover in the letting in that what you were protecting yourself from was, in large part, yourself. Which means you were never the danger. You were the solution, waiting to be known. Chapter 29, Resting the Overactive Mind. We have been on a long journey tonight. We began with a room going quiet and a mind that would not follow. We have moved through the whole architecture of the overaware psyche, the persona and the shadow, the complexes and the archetypes, the loneliness and the gift, the wound and the wisdom. And now we have arrived at a different kind of chapter, one that does not ask anything of you except this: rest. Let us pause here for a moment, not to meditate, not to fix anything, just to notice. Right now, your body is holding you. You do not have to do anything for that to be true. Let your attention move to wherever your body feels heaviest. Maybe your legs, maybe your hands, maybe the back of your head against the pillow. There is nothing to change. Just notice. The overactive mind has been working all night. Even in the listening, there has been processing. Even in the receiving, the awareness has been doing what it always does: taking in, sorting, weighing, relating to what is already known. That is all right. That is the instrument doing what it does. But now the instrument can rest, not because the work is done. The work of integration is never done, but because the body has been patient and the night has been long, and there is a particular kind of wisdom in knowing when to lay down the effort. Let your breath find its own rhythm. You do not need to make it deeper or slower. Just let it move the way it wants to move. If your mind is still busy, that is fine. Let it be busy in the background, like a television in another room, present but not requiring your full attention. For these next few moments, your only task is to feel the weight of your own body, to notice that you are here, that you are breathing, that you are safe enough to simply rest. The overaware mind, given real permission to rest, does something unexpected. It does not go blank. It does not cease its activity entirely, but it shifts from the active, forward-leaning, processing mode into something more receptive, more receiving than analyzing, more allowing than directing. This is the state in which the unconscious communicates most freely, in which the dreams come in which the insights arrive not as conclusions of active reasoning, but as images, feelings, quiet certainties that were waiting for the noise to soften. The resting mind is not an absent mind. It is a receiving mind. And what it receives from the vast interior life that has been building all these years is worth the wait. You have spent a significant part of your life working to understand what is happening inside you. That is not wasted. Every moment of genuine self-attention, even the ones that felt circular or inconclusive or exhausting, was adding something to the architecture of a self that knows itself. And a self that knows itself is gradually less at war with itself, less needing to manage and more able to simply exist, less running the monitoring system and more willing to rest inside the monitoring, trusting that what needs to be noticed will be noticed, and that what does not need to be noticed tonight can wait until morning. Let your jaw soften completely. Let the muscles around your eyes release. Let the breath become very slow. The story is almost at its end tonight, and the ending is not a conclusion. It is an opening, the one you have always been moving toward. Chapter 30. Returning to the deeper self. There was a room at the beginning of tonight, a quiet room, a mind that would not stop, a particular quality of aliveness that is the signature of the person who notices everything and who has spent a long time wondering what to do with all the noticing. That room is still here, but perhaps it is a little quieter now. Not because the awareness has stopped. It has not. It will not. That is not how this works, and it was never the promise. But perhaps there is, in the body somewhere, something that has shifted slightly, a permission that has been extended, a recognition that the map that was always pointing toward wholeness, not performance, not perfect management, not the silence of the overactive mind by force, but genuine, imperfect, accumulated wholeness has been here all along. The deeper self is not a mystical concept in Jung's work. It is simply the self that exists beyond the persona, beyond the complex, beyond the accumulated adaptations and defenses and performance strategies that were built for good reasons in conditions that no longer fully apply. It is the self that was there before the awareness became a burden, before the watching began, before the environment required the calibration, not the unformed self of early childhood. Something older and more fundamental than that. The pattern of who you actually are, beneath all the layers of who you learned to be. Jung called it the self with a capital S, to distinguish it from the ego self, the organizing principle of the whole psyche, the thing that individuation is moving toward, the destination that is also always the origin, the breath moving, slow, and even now, the weight of the body fully resting. What does it feel like to return to that deeper self? It does not feel like revelation. It does not arrive with ceremony. It feels usually like a very slight relaxation, a small dropping of something that has been held without noticing it was being held. It feels like the particular quality of being alone in a room that you trust, where you do not need to adjust anything, where the awareness can simply be without needing to do anything with what it perceives. It feels like the moment when you stop explaining yourself even to yourself and simply exist here, in the body, in this breath, in this particular fragment of time that is irreplaceable, unrepeatable, entirely and completely yours. Carl Jung, writing to a student late in his life about the purpose of the long inner work, said something that returns to this conversation. He said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." He did not mean achievement. He did not mean the resolution of every conflict or the elimination of every shadow. he meant the ongoing, incomplete, beautiful process of moving toward genuine self-recognition, of becoming, gradually and imperfectly, more of what you already most essentially are. For the overaware person, this is not about becoming less sensitive, less complex, less aware. It is about becoming more fully that, more at home in it, more able to inhabit the awareness without being exiled by it, more able to rest. The 7 days ahead do not ask very much. Day 1, notice without naming. Today, when a thought or feeling rises that is difficult to categorize, try simply noticing it without immediately naming it. Do not ask what it means or where it comes from. Just acknowledge its presence. Say silently, "You are here," and let it be here without judgment. Day 2, the body first. At some point today, check where your body is before you check where your mind is. Before reaching for the phone, before reviewing what needs to be done, just feel your feet on the floor, your breath, the temperature of the air. Start from the body and let the mind catch up. Day 3, 1 unmonitored hour. Give yourself 1 hour today in which you are not watching yourself, watch yourself. Solitude, or something absorbing enough to quiet the inner observer. A walk, music, a piece of work that takes everything. Not self-improvement, just being. Without the witness running commentary. Day 4, the shadow moment. Today, notice one reaction that seems larger than the situation warranted. A flash of irritation, an unexpected sadness, a disproportionate judgment of someone else. Do not analyze it. Just note it with a kind of gentle curiosity. That's interesting, you might say. And return to your day. Day 5, receive something. Today, when someone offers something, a compliment, a kindness, a genuine acknowledgement, resist the impulse to deflect or minimize. Let it in. Let it land. You do not have to perform gratitude. Just allow the thing to actually reach you. Day 6. The honest question. At some point today, ask yourself not what you should do, but what you actually need. Not what is productive or responsible or impressive. What the self that lives beneath the persona actually requires right now. And give it something in that direction, even something very small. Day 7. Return to the quiet. Tonight, before sleep, lie still for 2 minutes in silence. No audio. Just you and the dark. Let whatever is present be present. You do not have to make it profound or purposeful. You only need to let the quiet do what quiet does. Restore the instrument that has been in use all week, and trust that the restoration is happening even when you cannot feel it. We began tonight in a quiet room, a mind still running, a particular kind of aliveness that is both gift and weight. A person who has spent years wondering what to do with the fact of their own depth. We end in the same room. But perhaps the room feels slightly different, not resolved, not finished, but acknowledged. The awareness that has been your companion all these years. The watching, the reading, the carrying of more than most people register. It is not the obstacle between you and rest. It is the instrument through which rest, truly arrived at, becomes most deeply felt. You have been aware all your life. Tonight, for a little while, let something be aware of you. The deeper self, the unconscious, the larger life that has been moving quietly beneath the surface of all this noticing. It has been here the whole time, patient, waiting, not to be analyzed, just to be met. Close your eyes. Let the night hold you. You have done enough. Sleep now.